Good afternoon from London. Good evening or good night to those of you joining us from Asia, and good morning in Stanford, where one of our panelists is joining us. My name is Erik Berglof. I'm the director of the LSE Institute of Global Affairs at the LSE School of Public Policy. You are most welcome to this webinar, Crucial Role of State Capacity in the COVID-19 Response. This is part of a series of COVID-19 and early lessons from the pandemic that we are organizing at the LSE. So many economic models and policy recommendations assume a state that can deliver, whether it's about raising taxes from the population or investing in infrastructure necessary for economic growth, or delivering the various public goods that are needed to address a pandemic, the combination of a medical emergency and economic crisis that we've seen in the COVID-19. But economics has become increasingly focused on the variation across countries in states' capacity to deliver in different dimensions. The COVID-19 pandemic has put this variation into sharp relief, with some countries responding with remarkable speed and efficacy, while others have been slow in reacting, and when they finally acted, they've done so with less resolve and often with inferior results. But we also see countries, particularly in the emerging and developing world, that blindly copies policies which has been successful in advanced economies, often with mixed results, as they often do not have the state capacity needed to implement these policies and face very different local conditions. Understanding what determines and how to build state capacity is a bit of a holy grail for economics and more generally for social science. If we could build state capacity everywhere, we would be much closer to solving the many challenges the world faces over this century. Of course, we are not just talking about state capacity at the national level, but many challenges are global and require state capacity at the global level. But where does state capacity come from and how do you build it? That is what today's session is about. Of course, the capacity may come from the outside the state, from an active civil society, and we'll probably have some discussion of that. 2 weeks ago, we had an interesting discussion with Samuel Bowles and Wendy Carlin, among others, of the importance of civil society and other logics than that of the state and the market. So we have a fantastic panel that will allow us to discuss all these issues, and I will introduce them as they speak. We also, of course, want to bring in questions from the audience. Most of you are getting used to the Zoom technology now, but you can use the Q&A function and the chat room to ask questions. We're also broadcasting over Facebook, and you can post questions over the comments function, and we'll try to bring them to the panel. When you ask questions, please introduce yourself with your name and affiliation, but I'll come back to that when we are done with the presentation. So our first speaker today is Tim Besley, a colleague of mine at the LSE and one of the foremost thinkers on state capacity. His book with Torsten Persson, Pillars of Prosperity, is probably the best textbook on the topic. One core thesis in that book is what they call the Anna Karenina theory of development. To paraphrase Tolstoy's, all happy families are alike, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. And so less developed countries is often less developed in their own ways. And this insight, of course, is not new, but they provide in this book, Tim and Torsten Persson, they provide a conceptual framework, a lot of data that can help us think about these differences. That book is almost a decade old now, and Tim is now going to give us an overview of how to think about state capacity in the context of COVID based on his recent work. So please, Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Erik. I'm just sharing my screen here, so hopefully everyone can see the slides. So I'm going to talk a little bit, give you a bit of an overview of some of the issues, and then get into the central topic of today, which is, of course, about the crisis that we're all living through. I'm going to begin just by, for those of you who are not familiar with the term state capacity, I'm just going to start with a bit of an overview of what is state capacity and why it matters. And broadly speaking, state capacity is that set of things which makes states effective in intervening in the economy. And we tend to think of three categories of state capacity: fiscal capacity, which is the power to tax; legal capacity, the power to achieve the rule of law and to regulate markets where needed; and collective capacity, the ability of the state to deliver public services and goods to their citizens. And the reason I was drawn, and Torsten and I were drawn to studying state capacity when we got into this area, was because we felt that debates were too mired in what I would say is a rather passé debate about the size of government, when what we should really be thinking about is, if we are going to advocate state intervention, we should only do so where we believe it can work better than the market. And that's going to depend on the state having the capability to improve upon the market. And so I guess a mantra for state capacity is we want to make states smarter, not necessarily larger. And that's kind of the investigation of state capacity that we've been engaged in, as Erik said, for more than 10 years now. Just to sort of frame the issue, here's a picture just to talk about fiscal capacity, because people often don't realize just what a remarkable century the 20th century was in building the state in different dimensions. So what this figure here shows you are the tax share in GDP, which is the continuous green line. And for a set of countries, it's not a random set, but it's a set of countries for which there's comparable data across the 20th century. But it wouldn't, I don't think, be particularly different if we took a different set of countries. And the thing that's remarkable about this, and you should bear in mind, is that in the early part of the 20th century, on average, states were, even high tax states, were on average levying about 10% of taxation in GDP, maybe a little more, 10, 12. But by the end of the 20th century, it was not uncommon for states to be levying between 35, 40% of tax in GDP. On average, for this sample of countries, it was around 25%. So there really was a transformation in the state. Now, of course, this was happening alongside a number of other things that states that were doing. But this is just an indicative picture for you to bear in mind and to ask yourself the question, well, how did this happen? Why did this happen? And how does it have a bearing on what states can and cannot do? What drives state capacity? Well, that's a whole research project, and I'm not going to go into it in any detail. But the broad argument is that state capacity is more likely to be built, whether it's of any of the three kinds I described, in states that are relatively cohesive, those where there's some agreement on the common purposes for which the state should be deployed. It's driven, though, by some factors which are more historic: endowments, the nature of the countries concerned, maybe some of their cultural history, maybe some of their economic history. But centrally, and this will be something we get onto in this debate and discussion today, the politics and institutions of countries are absolutely critical in understanding the kind of state capacity that they build. And in particular, Torsten and I have put a lot of weight on the importance of institutions that constrain the abuse of power. Because if state capacity is about making the state more powerful, creating that state capacity, you're going to have adequate ways of constraining the potential abuse of that capacity by the state. And the other area, and I'm going to leave this to Margaret because she's much better qualified to discuss this than I am, is an important and central role in civil society in building state capacity, and in particular the role of many dimensions of that, but one is reciprocal norms. In the crisis, all elements of state capacity have been incredibly important. Fiscal capacity, because states are having to lay their hands on large amounts of public resources in order to have the capacity to borrow in many cases. States are not increasing, for very obvious reason, tax takes during the crisis. So they need to allow debt to take the strain. And of course, countries with weak fiscal capacity are unlikely to be able to borrow either at favorable terms, if at all. And so we've seen fiscal capacity is absolutely central to the crisis response, to the extent that states have had to increase spending without having the immediate desire to increase taxation. The second is legal capacity. We've seen all sorts of ways in which the state has regulated economic activity, everything from enforcing lockdowns to try and encourage people to behave in particular ways. And then finally, collective capacity. One of the central planks of the crisis response has been social protection. In particular, if you take the example of the UK, the implementation in very rapid time of a furlough scheme to protect workers who otherwise would have been made unemployed. And of course, central to it all is the provision of healthcare. So state capacity has been there pivotally in the background in the response to the crisis. And so understanding what the implications of the crisis are for state capacity going forward is really rather important. Now, Erik mentioned this earlier, many states in the world have not built the kind of state capacity that those of us who live in the developed world take for granted. Lack of state, particularly states, fragile states around the world, one of the hallmarks of that has been the absence of state capacity. It's not the only feature. And the absence of state capacity has been created that kind of self-reinforcing cycle that drives endemic long-run poverty. You cannot build an effective market economy without having the rule of law. I mean, that's a grand statement, but I'd be willing to defend it in Q&A if anyone wants to dispute that. You have to have basic legal devices, the protection of property rights and other things, in order to begin to build an effective market economy. If you lack the state capacity to build an effective economy, that means you have a weak economy, and typically you also have ineffective public sector responses. And of course, behind all of that lies the very thing you need to build state capacity, which is the lack of cohesive policymaking environments, so that states lack the legitimacy to act. This, as we know in the crisis, has created an urgent need for external support in those countries that lack the state capacity to be able to react autonomously. And one issue, and I hope that we'll come back to this in Q&A, is that we mustn't lose sight of the longer term challenges. One of the main issues, or one of the central issues in state fragility, has to be failure to provide a roadmap in situations where we're trying to provide humanitarian assistance. And so we may end up even weakening state capacity rather than strengthening it during a crisis. There have been many challenges to state capacity during the crisis. There have been really three shocks. One is the health shock, of course, which precipitated this, the attendant economic shock. And I think when we come to write the history books of this crisis, we will also write about a political shock and the challenges this has placed all times of political systems in conducting the normal business of politics, trying to react. And why has that political shock been so evident? I think it's because we are in a world where there really is radical uncertainty, and both the underpinning knowledge we need to fight the health pandemic, the pandemic, and to manage the economy is taking us into totally new territory, where the standard rules and ways of operating of a system are very poorly understood. And that's manifested itself in a lot of uncertainty about what government's objectives are. What are governments going to do? I mean, a lot of us are talking about what happens if there's going to be a second wave of the COVID pandemic towards, say, the end of this year or whenever it happens. And it's very hard to forecast at this point what governments are going to do. So a lot of uncertainty is being created around what are the motivations of government and what are their responses. Governments being asked to manage a certain kind of trade-off, sometimes very crudely put, as lives versus the economy. I think that's probably not very helpful, but nobody is very clear about what a good outcome is from the pandemic at this point. I think many people will have their views, but I don't think there's a carefully articulated view, and that contributes to this idea of there being a political shock. Many of the economic shocks that we're experiencing are conscious decisions of policy. The idea of locking down an economy, and those are causing the lion's share of the economic costs. So these are acts of commission, not omission. very often, if we look back, say, take the 2010 financial crisis, or 2008 financial crisis, is often by saying government didn't do something that we thought it should do, like regulating the financial sector. This is really rather different. This is about governments taking conscious decisions that are leading to economic stresses in the economy. So it's a very different place, and that's why I think that's part of the political shock. And then finally, compliance. Citizens are being asked to do things, very often acting against self-interest. And governments do, of course, a certain amount of that all the time, but to the degree that it's being asked of citizens now, I think makes this pandemic really rather different. Okay, I'm nearly done. Two other quick sort of warm-up slides. It's very evident to me, at least, having spent some time in the policy-making area during this crisis, that more work is needed on particular aspects of state capacity, which for those of us who are studying state capacity, we were perhaps paying too little attention to. One is communication capacities of the state. As I said earlier, we are not very clear for most countries what the objectives are. Some have been much clearer than others. And communicating those objectives clearly to the citizens is something that I think governments will, in retrospect, when there's some time to reflect on this episode, be something we think about. Are there better ways of government communicating about things like this that will enable them to get to a better solution, particularly around creating common purpose? Another is the wider debates about resilience, and are we doing the right kinds of horizon scanning to cope with what will be the future shocks that we face? Data capacities, they're very much under the microscope. Do we really have the real-time capacity to monitor what's going on in our economies and societies? And I think the answer is patently no. And if you think about a specific example, the need to implement in very short order some kind of tracing, testing, and isolation regime, and the data requirements and the capacity to implement that has been a real challenge in pretty much every government. And that's a really interesting kind of state capacity that I don't think we've been paying sufficient attention to. And then I think we are about to, as we try to manage the recovery from the shock, I think there will be some very interesting elements of state capacity. I think if you look back, say, at the New Deal style capacity building, which was really transformational in the American state in the 1930s, I think there's a really interesting opportunity to think about, do we have certain capacities that we're going to need to support the economy, and particularly to coordinate and finance private investment? We are going to be left with a need to provide the space for private firms to invest with confidence in the economy, and how we create that and what institutional framework we need to create that is a major challenge that will be left over. So just finally, and Erik mentioned this, what about capacities beyond the nation state? Well, one way of thinking about what we've seen in the last few weeks is, in a sense, this is the revenge of the nation state against the predictions of cosmopolitans, meaning that we really have seen the nation state being the primary actor. Almost all serious policy response to this pandemic has been at the level of nation states. Although even within that, we see some evidence of resurgent subnational units of government where responsibilities have been taken below nation state level. But almost nothing, I would say, of the global system has played a very pivotal role in meaningful ways so far. And of course, that's not to say it hasn't been important, and we do have a global architecture for supporting the emerging market world, and we may again get into that as we proceed. But the WHO very much under the microscope for its actions throughout this, and there will be much to be said on that. And the European Union too. I mean, again, the question of whether or not the European Union has really stepped up or been pushed up reluctantly to manage this crisis, but it's certainly not the case that it's in any way, shape or form displaced the important actions that have been taken at the level of nation states. And that raises the wider question, what is the scope for global state capacity? And I'll just leave you with one thought on that, that at the end of the day, fiscal capacity trumps everything. The reason why we have seen so much of the activity having to take place in nation states is that's the only place where governments can credibly generate revenues. And without generating revenues, it's pretty impossible to be a serious player in a crisis like this. And that's why we've seen this exposure, including at the EU level, of the weakness of supranational state capacity. And I'll leave it there.
Tim, thank you very much. I'm actually going to take the liberty of breaking a bit the order here, because there's a question from Rocho Ferro that I think ties in very nicely where you ended. It says, do you think that the present crisis has raised tensions between state capacity and the requirements of the state to act within an international framework? So the idea that, you know, you're now supposed to comply with international rules, for example, how you do your healthcare, or how you, you know, how does that fit into what you just said? Is that because you complained, and I think rightfully so, that we haven't seen much evidence of the capacity of the global community to exert itself in this crisis? But is there a tension here between individual states having capacity and the international community trying to? Because it is a pandemic, what happens, for example, the weakest link is very important. And if you have, how do you see that tension?
Well, I mean, I think, as you could tell from my presentation, I think that tension is real. And, there's lots of reasons why that should be the case. I mean, we do have, because of the nature of accountability in nation states, the ability of policymakers to act quickly and in response to the demands of their citizens. There is nothing of that kind of direct accountability. It's all indirect via nation states in almost every international institution. And so you simply cannot get either the speed of action or the decisiveness of action. And you'll know only too well, Erik, from your time at the EBRD, that things are really rather different than how they were when the G20, for example, stood up during the period of the global financial crisis. So it's not that there's an impossibility of acting in a concerted way, but I don't think the institutional frameworks that we have in place are really fit for purpose when it comes to a global pandemic like the one that we've been through. And we will certainly be, as the dust settles, I hope, having a proper debate about what we can do. If you recall, coming out of the Second World War, the Bretton Woods institutions were built because of what have been the perceived failures of the interwar period. And we need to have the same soul-searching debate right now about international institutions, and then act on it, and be sure that we build it with sufficient governance and decisiveness, so that whoever is running those institutions has sufficient commonality of purpose, that they aren't paralyzed then by fractious international debates, because that I think is at the moment causing many of our international institutions, because we simply can't build the decisive coalitions internationally, not to be able to act with the same decisiveness as nation states.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure we'll come back to this in the discussion. So the next speaker is Margaret Levi. She's a professor of political science at the department professor at the political science department of Stanford. But maybe more important is she is also the director of the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. It's a paradise of sorts for academics, and you can get a sense of that by looking at her virtual screen, which shows how beautifully placed it is. I had the pleasure to spend perhaps my most productive year as a researcher at the center. So Margaret has worked on comparative political economy, labor politics, democratic theory, trying to explain, what creates a trustworthy government. And her relatively recent groundbreaking study of labor unions in the interest of others, organizations, and social activists, she develops a whole new theory for how some organizations expand their scope much beyond what would be in the direct interest of their members. So, Margaret, few people could be more suited to comment on this than you. Thanks. So the floor is yours, Margaret.
Thanks, Erik. Can't wait to have you back at Caspis sometime. Please think about it. I'm going to share my screen too, but my slides are just pictures. So some reason doesn't want to come up. Okay, give me a minute here. Don't know why it's. Okay. There we
Tim,
go.
okay, it's coming.
You got
Yeah,
it?
yeah, perfect, perfect.
Okay. Well, let me go to the beginning of it. Okay, my emphasis today is really going to be on civil society and the role that civil society plays in creating state capacity. And right now, civil society is playing an immense role. When we think about the response to COVID, the ways in which people are changing their behavior, that's part of civil society. And of course, I'm in the United States where we're having a resurgence of a major racial justice movement, which is another response of civil society to some of what is going on and to thinking about the trustworthiness of government. So I want to talk about the ways I'm going to talk about 3 different terms here. So there's going to be a little bit of definition. What I'm really concerned about is how citizens perceive a government's trustworthiness and legitimacy, and then how that affects their behavior. In particular, their engagement through voting and lobbying, though I'm not going to address that so much today. I'm really going to be thinking about compliance and behavioral consent, which can include the opposites: non-compliance, protest, resistance of various kinds. So let me start with some definitions, and then I'll get to this virtuous circle of government graph that I have up, picture that I have up. The first is thinking about what trust means. For me, trust, and from some of my co-authors, trust has to do with relationships and judgments. A trusts B to do C. And that means me, as A, has to figure out whether B actually has an interest in helping me and has the competence to do so. Now, that really tells us a lot about our interactions with people, but it can also say something about government. But what government is here is B. So what we really want to figure out is whether government is trustworthy, whether it has an interest in helping me, and whether it has the competence to do so. So we look at the objective attributes of the institutions that would ensure that they will act in our interest and can, in fact, do so. Can and will government deliver goods and services? And will it do so according to standards of procedural justice, to certain kinds of norms of fairness? So we've got trust and trustworthiness. Legitimacy, I would argue, is something slightly different. It's accepted and widely shared justifications for government selection on the one hand, and for its actions on the others, based on moral principles and beliefs and norms, as Tim was referring to. Trustworthiness is largely about process. Legitimacy is more about the values, including the values embodied in the process. So the perceived trustworthiness of government is a result of an interaction between citizens and governments about something particular, not generic or innate. So the questions and surveys, do you trust government generally, all of the time, some of the time, most of the time, really doesn't get at what most of us think. We think about whether the police are trustworthy, whether schools are delivering or healthcare systems are delivering on what they're supposed to do. So government actions clearly have a lot to do with determining what we think means trustworthiness, whether they're trustworthy or not. Are they delivering? Are they meeting standards of fairness? And government trustworthiness is often multidimensional, can be trustworthy in some regards and not others. And we're certainly seeing that in this crisis, where the healthcare systems have failed in many ways. Certain local governments have stepped up to the plate when national governments have not. We're seeing huge variations in governments on multiple dimensions of trustworthiness. But whether a government is perceived as trustworthy obviously also depends on what citizens think. how they perceive it. And those things can be affected by a whole host of factors, not all of them reality, as COVID is making clear, and as do all studies of partisanship. We see people who believe the health statistics, who believe the government, and people who do not, and act accordingly, or think that their governments are acting in their interest or not. When I think about measures of trustworthiness, I think that behavioral measures ultimately are much better than surveys. The problems with surveys are the questions are generally not nuanced, and they often tend to be measuring the popularity of politicians or a particular moment in time. Behavior tells us a lot more about what people really think. It's what they're willing to act on. And I've studied this in a variety of domains: tax paying, which Tim referred to, volunteering for military service or refusing to be conscripted, and various kinds of law-abiding behavior. And all of those, of course, are complicated by other factors, but at least you can measure and control for a variety of variables when you're looking at behavior, and not just the attitudes reflected at a moment in time in a survey. So that leads us to this diagram of the virtuous circle of government. When this was developed by me and Audrey Sachs and Tom Tyler, we were applying it to countries in Africa where there were both surveys of attitudes through the Afrobarometer, but also documentation of actual government and services. There wasn't sufficient behavioral data, but we made do with what we could. And what we did see was that this virtuous circle tended to exist, and it could be a non-virtuous circle if some of these pieces were broken. So trustworthiness of government was affected, obviously, by government performance, by perceptions of leadership motivations and by the actual motivations, and by administrative competence. And that led, if government was considered trustworthy, it leads to value-based legitimacy, which is reinforced or undermined by perceptions of procedural justice. And value-based legitimacy leads to a sense of obligation and willingness to obey, and that leads to behavioral legitimacy, which is compliance. And when we see large-scale compliance, that comes back and helps build the trustworthiness of government. So what does this help us understand about the current moment and the current crisis? COVID compliance is at least partially a measure of the trustworthiness of government. And we have some marvelous data now that exist, but not great analysis yet, I have to say. So here's some of the kind of data that exists. These are graphs that probably all of you have seen from Unicast. This one's of the United States, which is where Unicast began to do it. And what we're seeing here is the change in average mobility based on distance traveled after certain kinds of government appeals went into place and as the health crisis began to develop. And you can see that the best states in the United States get a C- on this, and the country as a whole gets a D-. So compliance is not particularly high. Sorry, let me go back to the, obviously going the wrong way. Oh, sorry. Okay, so this is the United States in terms of difference in encounter density, and we don't exactly improve in terms of this. We're still a D-. We're still in the best states, a C-. These are, this is a graph that is more international and makes comparisons with countries from all of the different continents. As we know, New Zealand in the light blue is doing particularly well in regards to affecting compliance behavior. This is the change in average mobility. The USA does not do very well. It's in fact competing with Brazil here for being very problematic in terms of its compliance behavior. This is difference in encounter density, and we see pretty much the same thing, except now the Great Britain is trying to compete with the United States for poor compliance behavior. All of this is put in terms of social distancing insights and government response when states of emergency were declared, etc. This is just giving the details of that. Okay, I'm going to get out of the slideshow now. Get out of screen sharing to finish up here. Okay, so what changes? So as I said, we have some marvelous data, but we don't really have good analysis of it yet, I would argue, though there's some attempts to do that. So a lot of work by social scientists still needs to be done. So that leads us to questions about what changes citizens' perceptions and therefore their behavior. Obviously, actions of government is an important part of that, but no one and no government trustworthy to everyone on every dimension. So we have to nuance that account. We also know that citizens lack historical memory. So the fact that government delivered 2 years ago on something they cared about doesn't matter a lot right now in the midst of a crisis. We know that norms matter, as Tim referred to, but we have also learned about the important role of underlying beliefs that affect perceptions. Beliefs about how the world works, about what government should do. This is where we get into notions of a political economic framework or a moral economy. The Thatcher-Reagan shift in the 1980s led to a change in ideas about what government had a responsibility to provide to us. Moreover, perceptions often jar with reality of both the world and government's accomplishments and actions. That's another role that beliefs could play. We know, for example, in the United States that crime went down for years, but the confidence in the capacity of government to maintain law and order did not decline. In fact, sometimes distrust of it went up. We know that the health realities of COVID, we've got lots of information about that, but not everyone believes it or reacts the same way. Now, my focus is on the social and political construction of beliefs about how the world works and what we can do about it. Sources of information and credibility of that information is only part of the story, and I would argue not even the most important part, though depending on where the information comes from, it can matter. Governance arrangements, however, have a huge impact. Perceptions of trustworthiness go up with transparency, procedural fairness, and real attention to voices of common citizens and not just the elites. Erik mentioned the book that I wrote with John Alquist, In the Interest of Others, where we look at labor unions and how they evoke certain labor unions, in this case, a series of dock workers unions, and the longshore workers in the United States, evoked from their members a willingness to act in very costly ways often on behalf of far distant others who could never reciprocate. What these unions were able to do, and what I think our countries can ultimately do, is create something like an expanded community of fate in which our destinies are perceived as intertwined, and we're willing to act in ways that may require some self-sacrifice in order to benefit the larger society. But that's not just created by a moment like what we have now. It has to be supported by institutions and governance arrangements that allow it to be sustained and maintained over time. So let me end with returning to the 3 terms with which I started. Trust of leaders combined with their demonstrated trustworthiness and legitimacy gives them the right to try to persuade citizens to go along with policies. Trustworthiness of institutions, both objectively and as perceived, allow individuals to engage in the debates and challenges that are prior conditions to decisions and action. The results are shared legitimating beliefs about what the government can ask of its members and the conditions under which citizens are willing to go along with these demands and to act in the interest of others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret, and very, very interesting. And we'll come back to some of those points you made. So the last speaker, certainly not least, is Adnan Khan. He's a professor and colleague of mine at the School of Public Policy. And before that, he was the policy director at the LSE Oxford International Growth Center, which deals a lot with state capacity in countries with a lot of fragilities. He's also been at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's been doing very interesting and original work on how to build state capacity from the inside, including in his native Pakistan. He has even run many innovative experiments to understand the impact of different measures. And he has an advantage, of course, having worked as a state official in his country, Pakistan. And he's now working with different governments on how to make their response to COVID more effective and how to deal with the economic and social impact. So Adnan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Erik. So let me just say a few words and then show a few slides. I'll take a perspective from the world of developing countries. So state capacity, as both Tim and Margaret mentioned, is the ability of state to enforce laws, regulate economic activity, and provide public services. And it's not just a determinant of economic development and trust of public, but it's also a major determinant of having an effective policy response to COVID-19, and also to citizen trust in state institutions. And that trust in turn deeply affects whether states can carry out an effective policy response in the first place. In other words, it creates a self-reinforcing cycle. And state capacity is not just a technical deficit addressed through technical interventions like training, copying best practices from outside, externally influenced institutional reforms. It's essentially an organic process whereby states gradually acquire capacity, learning by doing, only if they so desire. Sometimes lack of state capacity is by design, like Mobutu, I don't think never ever thought of building state capacity in Congo. Having said that, this notion of states with weak capacity, with monolithically, call it like dysfunctional, is far from truth. Does have a grain of truth, but is not very true and not very helpful. As Erik mentioned, most of my life I have worked in and with governments. And one of the overriding features of my experience was we were always fighting fires. So battered by one shock after another, dealing with problem of the day and hoping for the problems to go away. But not necessarily getting better at either predicting or fighting the next fires. So in terms of like either preparedness or resilience. And especially harder fires to fight were the ones that fell outside the standard organizational procedure for delivering services in developing countries. So one where a top level agent decides something and others implement. So the fires were the ones, the hardest fires were the ones where citizen involvement was essential, or the one where policy response didn't have to be uniform, but had to vary by people, places, and phases. And COVID-19 is precisely such a shock. So before I describe my work, the last word I would say is, yet within the same environment, there existed both highly motivated, capable individuals who were going way beyond the call of duty, but more importantly, there also existed subunits, call it public agencies, which are highly effective, in some cases, exceptionally effective. So high performing, highly motivated, full of pride. So more or less like organizational, functional organization subculture. Too few, with question marks over their, call it like resilience and sustenance, but still they existed. And that also resonates with the recent literature from various disciplines on state capacity that also points out to pockets of effectiveness in otherwise dysfunctional and weak states. So Dan Honig, for instance, attributes these to discretion and autonomy granted to these organizations. Maya Hassan, in her work on Kenya, attributes it to strategic choices made by leaders that induce bureaucratic effectiveness in areas where it furthered the policy and political goals of the leaders. Erin McDonald, in her work on Ghana and other places, talks about critical mass of people with a distinct subculture that cluster together to produce a highly effective unit. And the billion-dollar question obviously is, how do we sustain those? How do we diffuse these to the rest of the state? And how do we scale those up? And I'll come to those hopefully in question answers. But let me quickly describe the work that we have been doing, uh, mostly in Pakistan, but also colleagues have been doing similar work in parts of India and elsewhere, which is how do we actually work with the state with variable levels of capacity in order to actually deal and have an effective response, in this case to COVID-19. And the approach that we had, which is based on a coalition of people from inside and outside government and from multiple disciplines, um, public health, EPI guys, economists, public management people, people inside and outside government, with the idea to co-create state capacity with state partners. The idea being, yes, outside organizations can help put pressure on the state to improve its accountability and to deliver, but you can also work with the state, co-create state capacity, working with in collaboration with them. And our goal has been to both to create operational documents, produce relevant research, but also importantly, proof of concept implementation that states can then take forward. And the key question that not just us, not just Pakistan, but all countries have been facing is whether to have a lockdown or open up. With the trade-off being a shutdown prevents spread, but risks economic collapse and non-COVID health morbidity and mortality, whereas opening up minimize socioeconomic fallout, but risk thousands dying from COVID-19 shock. That can be moved beyond the curse of the binary choice. And that's the crux of the work that we did. The problem in countries like Pakistan, but also Africa and other places, is exacerbated by limited capacity, implementation constraints. You can't just wish, you can't just like make a response at the top and expect that agents of the state down below and citizens will also comply and implement it. The models that like the EPI models have been quite inadequate. They're useful as a starting point, but not enough, that we soon discovered. Data of the type that exists in developed countries doesn't exist in most developing countries. So how do you make any progress? And there's a clear sense of policymakers flying blind. Can we do better than that? But also blanket generic policies don't work. Can we have a response that varies across space and time to better match the context? So that was the objective. We just work with three basic principles. So there are details out there, happy to share those documents, but let me just share three basic principles on which this work was based. So one is the question of active promoting and embedding active learning. And by that we mean like collecting all kinds of data, representative outcome data at a high frequency for both COVID-19, morbidity, mortality, but also non-COVID health, to cater for unintended consequences of public policies, and also socioeconomic impact, and do all kinds of approaches, smart testing, robocall, phone surveys, cell phone, Google, all of those things are things that we're actually doing. And refine and change response based on how outcomes change as a result of policy response. In other words, address knowledge failures in real time and break decision deadlocks. So that was the first principle. Second principle, gridding, have like spatial response. So partition regions into smallest feasible isolatable grids, urban neighborhoods and villages. In many cases, like we have gone to the smallest possible unit of a census block with just 200 to 250 households, and to tailor policy response to each grid's situation and needs. In other words, like having an approach that allows for different localized and targeted therapies helps minimize health and economic losses. The third principle being grading, not just have one response throughout the country or throughout society, just like with terrorism threat level. So color code grades into different severity grades, standardize response by grade, and communicate the grade publicly for citizens to base their responses also on. So it simplifies implementing differential response and also enables effective public communication. This is how this approach would work. These are different areas, different census blocks within the same city in Lahore, all color coded by their disease status and also requiring very different degrees of policy response in each. And as you can clearly see that areas in green, which were the lowest levels of disease prevalence, are adjacent to areas which are high disease prevalent. And you need to have differential policy responses to the extent possible. And based on this, based on the level at which each area is and the needs of each area and where you are, all kinds of policies need to change. Here is a smart operation plan, simple, templatized in order to enable policymakers to base their response on the basis of simple templates. This is parts of it are being implemented in different areas in Pakistan. Again, a question where there are sharply divergent views of policymakers, where different governments with sharply different political views exist in the country. It's also a measure of, call it partly yardstick competition, but partly an attempt by outsiders to partner with agents within the state, that governments across the political divide have partnered in varying degrees to implement such an approach. Let me stop here. Happy to describe more in Q&A.
Thank you very much, Adnan. So we have a lot of questions, and those of you who know Zoom is that you can vote for different questions. So the audience get to decide which questions to be asked. So, and this is the only reason why I'm now asking a question of a colleague of mine, Kevin Featherstone, who's also a professor at LSE. So his question is by far the most popular one, but I think it goes to, the observation that maybe state capacity doesn't explain everything when it comes to how different countries reacted or responded. So Kevin's question is, one of the counterintuitive features of the pandemic has been the relative success of states thought to have weaker capacity. For example, Greece, and he's the professor of the Hellenic Center, so that may be a reason. And the problematic performance of others like the UK. Are there any comments to this? So just is UK an example of a state with a lot of fragilities, or failing state, a state that has weak capacities? Or how do we explain? My own country, Sweden, is essentially at the same level of performance as the UK in this. What are the limits to state capacity as an explanation for what we observe? Tim, should I give it to you first?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kevin's question is a really good one, and I don't think I have an entirely satisfactory answer, but I think there are a lot of questions about the international comparisons at the moment that, and I certainly wouldn't be in the position of arguing that state capacity is all that matters. I think I'll make a couple of comments though. I think if you look I think Kevin's being a little unfair to Greece to describe it as a weak state capacity country. I mean, by any global standard, it's a country with a well-developed state capacity. It's true that during the financial crisis, its weaknesses, particularly in its tax system and its financial side of the economy, were exposed. But by and large, I wouldn't put it in that global category of weak state capacity. But that doesn't really get to Kevin's point, because it's well taken. And the question of whether the UK has underperformed, given where it appears on the state capacity measures, I think is a really interesting one too. If you look at the GHS measures of global pandemic preparedness that were done way before the crisis, the two countries that were described as being the best prepared in the world for the pandemic by the GHS were the UK and the US. But yet, if you look now at the reported death statistics, I don't think they seem to bear that out. So it certainly suggests that there's a role for lots of particular factors around political leadership and the factors that trigger rapid response, which are not fully explained by having developed tax, legal systems, and even relatively high quality health systems. I think the question of politics remaining centrally here is key. I mean, Greece, interestingly, made a very early lockdown decision, which I don't think can be explained specifically by its state capacity. And so, yeah, Kevin's completely right that there are many other factors that go into the equation apart from the kind of regular state capacity elements.
Margaret, do you want to come into this as well?
Yeah, I want to emphasize as well the role of political leadership, which we clearly are seeing huge variations about. And it's leadership in terms of making decisions based on evidence and to act and to create certain kinds of policies that will protect the populace. And you know, in my own country, the federal government was pretty remiss in that regard, which certainly explains our underachieving to some extent. But it's also a question, I do want to get back to the civil society piece of state capacity, and that, you know, not enough thinking is going into, I mean, the Swedish case is a very interesting case, Erik, because there's a case which has a huge amount of civil society capacity to comply, and that was what was being counted on, that willing compliance would do a huge amount of the trick. And so what we've learned from the Swedish case is that in these kinds of crises, we need a combination of good state institutions, of which there's a lot of variation, particularly when we come to the capacity of our health systems to deliver and to deliver equitably. That gets into what is normally thought of as state capacity issues. There's a huge variation in political leadership. I think half the world would like the Prime Minister of New Zealand to be the head of their government at this point. But there's also a huge, and they also had some other advantages, an island that could shut itself off. But there's also a huge amount of variation in the willingness of a polity to who they believe, and their confidence in science, their confidence in leadership, their confidence in the institutions. And that's beginning to be very apparent in understanding why we're seeing very different reactions. I mean, here the US is a wonderful test case, because with 50 states, you actually have not just the federal leadership and the federal responses, but you can look at the huge variation among states within the United States, as well as we can begin to parse this eventually among countries.
So a question here that come up one along the sort of most highly rated question is a very simple one, and it starts exactly from this observation of New Zealand, that, you know, smaller countries, so islands, I think we understand, even though UK by some definitions is an island, but the size of the state, is there any lesson? This is a question from, I see who it was who asked this question. Anyhow, it was it was pointing to the experience of Finland, Latvia, you know, relatively small countries, I guess. It's from Hilary Briffa. Is it easier for smaller states to respond? Yeah.
Adnan might know. Adnan, so
yeah,
you have a
not necessarily. Let me say, first of all, state capacity is not just a theoretical concept. It's not just a de jure capacity of what exists on paper, but how it is deployed. So it's fundamentally also a question of political choice. And size is not necessarily a predictor of effective state capacity. Let me give you many examples. So one, Uganda and Rwanda, roughly states of the same size, having completely different policy responses. Rwanda having a quite sensible, smart policy, deploying high levels of state effectiveness, but also citizen compliance, while Uganda having a policy of a blanket lockdown where people were not allowed to go outside their home, where even going to hospitals would require getting permission from a state agent. And there were only 5 such agents throughout the country. And just imagine like the potential unintended consequences of such a policy. I can give you many other examples of states, even like a national units within large countries like India, Pakistan, any other countries, performing very differently. So it's fundamentally a political choice, and it's not just a question of also deployed state capacity, but also choices, political choices, and sometimes also a function of pockets of effectiveness, key individuals and pockets of effectiveness that may differentially exist in different places.
Tim was talking in his
Let me come in on the, I mean, I'm going to slightly widen out the question because there are a large number of people at the minute looking for correlates of apparent success in the crisis. And, you know, there are many different dimensions of that. It could be country size, it could be democratic versus non-democratic, it could be free media versus non-free media. There's a whole different set of dimensions out there by which states differ. And, you know, sooner or later, we will do our best to untangle all these different elements and say something about it. But I think it's way, way too early, and nobody, as far as I know, is doing a credible job. And the other problem is how does one sort of calibrate success here? Well, the success obviously in containing the infection, and that's something people are looking at. But if you look at the comparability of international data, you know, I don't think it can explain some of the huge differences across countries, but I think we may end up revising our measures even on that basis, particularly when we start looking at excess mortality rather than raw deaths. So there's a whole series of issues about how to actually calibrate and measure success. Of course, there'll be a whole new set of work to be done once we start to get a clearer picture of the economic consequences. And I don't just mean the aggregate consequences. You know, some economies' GDP will fall faster than others, but also it'll be clear some economies will have done a lot better on social protection than others. So even for a given fall in GDP, there may be much more hardship in some places than others because of the way the distribution of that hit has been felt. And I just think we're a little bit too early to be trying to say we have very compelling knowledge on that. I mean, and I, you know, of course, for an academic, you always say that, you know, we need to do more research, but really in this case, it's entirely unhelpful in the midst of all of this to start saying, yes, but it's factor A or B, because I think we're almost certainly going to get it wrong if we start expressing very strong views at this point. I think what we have to get on with and what we need to do is to give the best possible advice to governments and to point out where government could benefit from better knowledge input. And I think one of the areas that I talked about in my presentation is getting a much clearer statement on what success and failure means to governments themselves. I mean, I think New Zealand could be almost certainly quite proud of itself for the achievements during this crisis. And other governments would be less willing, I think, to stand up and say we have been successful for reason X or Y. But I do think we need to get a better debate on what is a good outcome, why are we doing things to achieve that better outcome. That's a much better debate to be having at the moment than looking over our shoulders and saying, can't we be more like Germany if you're Britain, or more like New Zealand? I don't think that's actually helping in the current crisis.
What I mean, the one aspect of size is, of course, heterogeneity. I mean, you said initially, and I think this is something that's important to your own work, that this sense of common interest. And so more heterogeneous societies, it is more difficult to create state capacity in.
Yeah, but we shouldn't confuse homogeneity and decisiveness, meaning that you can have a majoritarian government controlled by one particular faction at any point in time that speaks decisively in the current policy climate. But that doesn't mean that's a cohesive government, because there could be many people who are not buying into the actions of the current government. So I think we need to be a little careful with thinking about sort of stable, effective government and cohesive government. They're not one and the same. The cohesive government is about building broad-based coalitions for action and how we go about doing that. And I think things like media freedom are important there because actions are subject to sufficient public scrutiny, but also governments can better communicate their actions and try and build that kind of cohesive behavior. I'm sure Margaret's got something to
But
say.
I also think that what this is really revealing is the multiple dimensions of state capacity. So in the first question, the sort of emphasis on fiscal capacity as the measure of a capacity of government. So in that case, Britain and the US look very strong. But if you look at other dimensions of state capacity, the US is pretty weak in terms of its capacity to deliver healthcare equitably. We're pretty weak in terms of our social insurance systems. And so one of the things that we're beginning to, that this crisis is allowing us to see, unfortunately, is how these things are so interconnected, and that if you're going to be able to respond to a crisis, you can't think you're a strong state just because, or a good, an effective state, just because you have policing, military, and taxes, that it's a much more complex environment. And you look at a country like New Zealand, which might be tiny and might have certain kinds of advantages. It's not totally homogeneous, by the way. It's got its own ethnic and racial splits, but it has figured out, at least for the moment, how to intertwine those various aspects of state capacity, and to create a kind of community of fate around this crisis, fate, not faith, fate, around this crisis, and to build on that to create a cohesive politics. So it ultimately does come back to a combination of politics and institutions and how they're playing out with each other.
I mean, there's one story, if you look at the UK, where what seems to have been missing was a sort of coherent scientific story, so that it has sort of been changing over time, and politicians sort of use this in a way to try to create a kind of ambiguity about what science said and so on, to push their own policies. I don't know if you recognize this from any of your the studies you have worked with it. There is we need somehow in the political debate to have some element of a narrative that people can trust or not trust, but you need to create that narrative. Is that something that you have come across, the role of science in creating this capacity of the state?
Yeah, well, the role of science, I mean, the work on confidence in science and the trustworthiness of science, it's actually pretty high everywhere. That's one of the things that has not tended to decline seriously. The problem in this crisis, as you were pointing out, Erik, is that nobody exactly knows much about this disease. We don't really understand its trajectory. We know that we don't have a vaccine. The treatments are, I read the New York Times today, and the whole ideas about treatments are changing. So yeah, there's not a consistent story about it, but there is one narrative that is dominant, that the countries that have, I am going to put quotation marks around succeeded, because I think it's still too early to tell, but they've just emphasized that this is dangerous, and that there's certain very clear things that will help us. And they haven't gotten into in depth about the various kinds of drugs that will work or the treatments that'll work. That we know that social distancing and masks make a difference, and that we have to protect ourselves. And by protecting ourselves, we protect other people. So that's the narrative that really has, where it's worked, where there's been, quote, success, has been that very simple narrative. And there's no question that the politicians, where they have chosen to, have used the fact that science is a bit at a loss right now, about they're struggling, as science should, to try to find solutions, and their experiments and their failed attempts and their successful attempts. They've used that to create a kind of discord. But that again comes back to our politics and our institutions that allow that to happen. And an effort by politicians and by certain kinds of actors to create divisions where they don't need to exist. It's not the science's fault.
No.
Just following on from that, I think there's a very dangerous disconnect between we're listening to the science and we're outsourcing the decisions to scientists, and those two seem to get confused. At the end of the day, there are key decisions to be made by government. For example, we know that this has a huge intergenerational distributional impact, that the young are being disproportionately affected, and most of the scarring effect of this crisis will be felt by the young, who miss out on educational opportunities, on job opportunities. And that, at the end of the day, that we have to have that debate, and we have to have people who are upfront about the costs we're imposing and how we're doing that. On the other side of the ledger are the benefits, the health benefits. But I feel that quite often that balanced debate between, yes, and we know we're imposing costs and this could be generational, isn't quite figuring. And that's the role of politics, to both take the science, but not to hide behind the science. And I think it's a thin line, but it's one that really is a difficult balance to achieve. And I don't think some pronouncements that I've heard from various governments have got the right side of that line.
No. It is interesting. We thought that science would get a big push by this, but actually there's some recent work by Barry Eichengreen and others showing that actually those who were exposed in their formative years to pandemics are more negative on science. So they, it's also a way to show, as we have said now, science is more complicated than yes, there's no simple truth that and we don't know so much about this virus. Anyhow, there are so many questions here. I don't want to take away from that time. There's one question that is very highly rated by the audience, and it goes back to politics, of course, and it's about looking at Latin America. And it's Federico Diaz, who is a LSE alumnus. He says South America faced an extreme privatization of public services such as health, pension system, and so on, plus an enormous level of inequality. How will this affect the COVID response in these countries? Well, we know that Latin America now is at least one of the epicenters. What do we learn about state capacity from that experience and privatization? Tim,
Well, I do think.
No, okay, Margaret, please. Margaret, go. Please.
I do think that one of the major issues that's coming out of this crisis, and it's not just for Latin America, though that's a strong example of this, is where Tim just ended, actually, with the distributional effects and the inequality of access to various kinds of services and to programs. And that's, of course, creating another level of politics that we're going to be addressing for years. That what this has made so apparent is that there are big winners and losers. So Tim emphasized the intergenerational impact of the economic crisis that has been generated by the health crisis. But it's also revealing other kinds of, in the United States, obviously, it's raising, once again, and making it hard for all of us to ignore the kinds of racial disparities that have existed. And that's true in Brazil as well, and in many Latin American countries where that is going to be shown. So it's creating another kind of popular politics and resistance, protest, demands on government, which I think in the long term are healthy and will make us better polities if we're able to take advantage of this moment and transform our institutions. I mean, I'm part of a project which is really thinking about, and this relates to the earlier webcast that you did with Wendy Carlin and Sam Bowles, in really thinking about what kinds of political economic structures we need going forward. We were already having some problems with the ones that existed even before the COVID crisis. The structures of supply side economics and neoliberalism were beginning to fail us. And this crisis only reveals more strongly how much we need new political institutions, a new kind of politics. The democracy that I live in is now over 200 years old, and a lot of the rules and constitutional arrangements are no longer relevant to the current era. So we have to rethink some of our institutions, some of our economic processes and ways of doing things, and our politics itself.
And just following on that, and I agree with what Margaret just said. I think one thing on state capacity in Latin America, I had to give a talk about 5 or 6 years ago, and I'd never just done a scatter plot of different measures of state capacity in Latin America in preparation for the talk. I just looked at where they were relative to the relationship between income and state capacity across the world. And consistently, all of the Latin American countries were lying below the line. They were, in other words, outliers of a negative kind on state capacity. And so, I mean, of course, that doesn't imply any kind of insight into what's going on. But of course, equally, if you draw that same picture and you put high inequality countries, you tend to find they're also below the line. And I think and so, you know, saying that, you can infer from that therefore it's the inequality dimension of Latin America that is leading to the weakness of state capacity, is not necessarily convincingly established by a scatter plot like that. But then if you dig deeper, I think the thing that one is struck by is not just it's the nature of economic inequality, but the way that translates into political inequality and the nature of the elite politics in many countries of Latin America and the consequences of that for the way the state functions and who it chooses to prioritize in the way it directs its operations towards different groups in society. And I think there is something real in that. Of course, it's a long-standing theme among those who study the politics of Latin America, but it's real. And I think we are seeing that playing out in its own way in the current crisis across many of the countries. Even though I don't profess to be an expert on Latin America, it's really manifest in some of the countries where very, very clearly there's a real struggle going on to cope with the crisis.
Adnan, you must have come across this in Pakistan for sure. I mean, this issue of privatization.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is I agree with everything. Is historically, I think major investments in state capacity have usually followed wars, like in Europe and other countries, or similar such experience of shared sacrifice and shared purpose. Think of the Depression, like New Deal era increase in state capacity, or the building of welfare states in many countries after World War II. Whether this current crisis leads to a similar inflection point in developing countries, Latin America and other countries, depends a lot on, I would say, nature of politics there. Whether it's cohesive politics of the type that Tim is talking about, with checks and balances, trust and legitimacy in the state, and the nature of politics being such that it helps leverage a sense of shared sacrifice into concrete policies. Versus whether it's a question of like you have a polarized polity, there's no sense of common purpose, which is also true for many countries. And in Latin America, thinking of Chile, where Federico comes from, or Brazil and other places, high levels of inequality may translate into polarized polity and may not be conducive to a sense of shared sacrifice that may help change the trajectory of history.
Margaret, there's a question for you here. You mentioned that the citizen's memory is quite short when it comes to trusting government for things that happened in the past. This is from Orkun Saka, Sussex, and LSE. Do you think also this applies to disasters and failed policy responses? In other words, do you think citizens' trust in government may be scarred due to COVID-19, especially in those places that disappointed their citizens?
Well, I think that there is a symmetry in the ways in which citizens perceive government trustworthiness. So it's very hard to earn, but it's very easy to lose. And then it's hard to rebuild it again. And so I do think that in cases like huge failures in state capacity during pandemics and disasters do have a scarring effect. that can last for a much longer period of time. On the other hand, when governments deliver very well, that tends to be relatively short-lived in terms of citizens' memory. As soon as there's sort of a mistake or a problem, that tends to gain dominance. I can give concrete examples of that from history and around the world, but given I don't want to give a whole lecture on that. So I think that that's a common understanding of the way in which the sort of dynamics of the of citizen perceptions of trustworthiness works.
Erik, if I could just comment briefly on this. I think there's an important difference between what I'll call the narrative around battles and wars. So what do I mean by that? You can lose battles, but only if you articulate why that was a sensible decision to engage in that battle as part of a war. And I view that as very similar, as a kind of good metaphor for what makes government effective. You can have failures, and almost certainly you will, but if people have a sense of a wider strategic objective, which is arrived at and can be articulated, they're willing to accept some of the setbacks. Now, of course, if there's just setbacks all the time, nobody's going to believe in the grander narrative of the justice of the war, if you like. But I think when we're thinking of COVID, there will be many things we do poorly. But if people see a wider strategy that has a coherence, they're going to be willing to offset some of those failures because they can see the wider vision. And what worries me is the lack of articulation of that wider narrative, in which you can wear a certain amount of lack of success in order to have that grander vision of what you're trying to achieve.
Let me
If
totally
I would comment again here, I would say that I agree with Tim, but developing a narrative, a common narrative, is also like a process and not an event, and active learning is also needed here, more so for developing countries, because some of your early actions and may fail, but how do you learn from those? How do you course correct? How do you institute error correction mechanism is a key part of that. Is a key part of how, whether you build local organic capacity, whether you build or leverage from the pockets of effectiveness and build generalized capacity, but also help address some of those underlying drivers of state capacity.
So there are some questions on the role of culture for state capacity. So one question comes from Jing Zhang, UCL, and the question is really about face masks and the observation that in Asia, for example, it's much easier to get acceptance for people wearing face masks. So the question is, what factors do you think may better explain this behavior? So people's willingness to wearing face masks. How can we make an analysis about it? But I guess it's related to a broader issue of is it easier to get compliance, this behavioral legitimacy based on values that comes out of culture? Margaret, probably this is for you.
Well, I think culture can play a role in it, but let's put the Asian context here into play, because their experience with SARS and some other health problems in the past it's not just a question of culture, it's a question of learning too. So I think this is getting to some of the stuff that Adnan was talking about as well. They've had a series of experiences in most Asian countries that have prepared them to deal with this. Now, there is obviously a variation in cultures that can have huge consequences for compliance behavior. And that often that culture is, again, it's based on historical experience. So if your history with government has been one in which this is a problem for Francophones in Canada, for some of the Irish in the UK. I mean, it's not just a racial problem. It's a question of perceptions of whether government is serving your interest or not, and that will then affect whether you're more likely to be compliant with its demands, because that larger narrative, as Tim was describing it, of whether the strategies are there to really help you, may not exist for those particular groups. And so that will affect that compliance behavior. And that's cultural in one sense. In another sense, it's really historical. It's really experiential.
Anyone else want to come in on the role of
I just
culture?
want to add one other thing. The other way in which culture, as it were, could play into this is what we're seeing in the United States with mask wearing, where our president has made it a point of honor not to wear a mask, and is thus sending a message, as it were, a cultural message and story to a group of a certain kind of supporters. And so it's become, you can almost tell who's a Democrat and who's a Republican walking around by who's wearing a mask and who isn't. Is that cultural or is that politics?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there is of course, discussion in particularly in the sociological literature, but also in political science. I think the distinction between strong societies and weak states, or it's how. So there's a question here from Anya Ekbo, and she says she's at Dartmouth College and an LSE alumna. I would like to seek views on states that in the last administrations have been stripping out the public sector and finances prior to COVID-19, as in Mexico. And, said Mexico was, by Joel Migdal, qualified as weak state, strong societies. How do you see that tension? That I think is for you, Margaret, again.
My old colleague, Joel Migdal,
yeah.
At the University of Washington. Well, we're seeing a lot of hollowing out of states. That's been going on really since the 1980s, and a certain kind of ideology, as I was referring to before, that saw the role of government as being should be reduced, and we're bearing those effects right now in a number of countries. In terms of the strong society, weak states analogy, I'm not exactly sure how that plays in here, because there are so many factors going on. I mean, we've talked about the distributional effects of both the health system and of economics. So a strong society in this case would have to also be coordinated around something. And I think we're seeing cleavages, not coordination, in a lot of societies, partially created by leadership, but not only.
Yeah, and if I could just add to this, I mean, I think it's dangerous to get locked into what is state, what is private. I mean, at the end of the day, it's about purpose and what institutions and organizations exist to do and how they achieve it. I mean, there is this narrative around, we as you say, weak states, strong societies, but equally, Bob Putnam in his work on Italy pointed out that it's exactly in those places where civil society is strongest that the state works better. So that looks like a complementarity between state and society, and I'm more convinced that that's a model. And why? It's because at the end of the day, state and society and markets work around creating a common sense of purpose. The moment we need, for example, markets to be investing for the long term to help aid the recovery. So the fact that they're motivated by profit predominantly, it is about creating purpose that's useful to society. At the moment, that is job creation and investment. So all the time, it's about getting people pushing together in the same direction so that the state, the civil society, and the private sector work together to achieve prosperity and well-being for all. And that's the trick. And I think breaking it down into tensions between those different elements, I think really gets away from the fact it's when they work together that we create successful polities, countries, and societies. Okay,
I think we are unfortunately running out of time. I heard 40 questions in the Q&A, and we had a few on Facebook as well. Thank you very much. It's been a most interesting discussion. I think we all agree that it's too early to say that certain countries have succeeded and others have failed. We have some early evidence, but it's, to be conclusive on this. And probably we also agree that state capacity is only one of the possible explanations of these differences across countries. But I think we got a very rich idea what can constitute civil state capacity, how civil society plays a role in this, how you can build state capacity from the inside from Adnan's work. So thank you very much. It's been very enriching, and we will also share all the questions with you panelists if you want to pursue them with the individual questionnaires later. So thank you very much.
Thank you.